Larson, I think that question was for you. So I now now we're going to go to our closing group. So I'm going to introduce just a couple more speakers. Now at this point, we want to talk about, we've given you all these details. Do you want to stand here or do you want to walk around?
Take a quick break.
Yeah, actually, 5-minute break. Take a run for the rest of it. Now, all right, let's go.
All right, thanks for everybody for holding on to the end. This has been a great day that we've shared a lot of information, seen some new folks, renewed some folks I've known for a long time. So I'm Stephanie Larson, as Mark said, I'm with UC Cooperative Extension that cover Marin and Sonoma counties. And I have this, my title is not very exciting, listen, and outreach, but match.graze.com, that might get more of an interest for you. So I want to talk about this concept I came up with. Following, the picture's not dropping, but what that picture would look like is, it unfortunately shows the picture of the Tubbs fire and a neighborhood destroyed by the Tubbs fire in Sonoma County. And so my point is, what does it take for a community to really recognize that we have to start looking at managing our vegetation? If we're going to build homes in the WUI, in the I-zone, in whatever you want to call it, we're building homes in areas that burned 40 years ago. In the Hanley fire, the Tubbs fire burned in the exact same place 40 years later, and we've lost 5,000 homes in Santa Rosa, in Sonoma County. And so with the fire, we went out and looked at these homes, and I went out with the Santa Rosa Fire Department, and I went with CAL FIRE. And I kept saying, well, what if we had grazed? What if we had grazed this area more? And they were very polite, and then just reminded me it was a 90-mile-an-hour wind and nothing was going to stop the fire, and no grazing would have stopped the burning of Kmart. But it at least got me thinking, okay, but how do we start having that dialogue? How do we slow these down, or how do we prevent this happening again? So I started looking at, how do we understand vegetation management? How do we teach people to do that? How do we adopt the tools for vegetation management? So what does it take? So thinking about it, is this idea, and I've worked with CAL FIRE a lot, is like, do we continue just to put out the fire, or do we get the grazing in? Do we start managing our vegetation ahead of time so we don't have that fire? So just a little bit of background was, I've been in extension for over 30 years. I started when I was very young, had a note from my mom. But anyway, I digress. But I've always been pushing grazing. And so it's like, what do we need to do to get more people in grazing? Well, unfortunately, we had to have a big fire. And then we had subsequent fires after that. So now people are talking about, oh, what if we implement grazing? So we all know this. We have vegetation control options. We have chemical control, we have mechanical, we have manual, fire, we took fire out and now fire's back again. We're looking at it from prescribed fire. We're all looking at developing prescribed burn associations, because now fire is sexy. So how do we make grazing sexy? How do we get grazing back more acceptable, or people more wanting grazing in the mix than haven't before? Or how do we start to use all the tools in the toolbox? So thinking about grazing as a biological control, a method, it's a green method. You all are very supportive of grazing. So how do we get that word out? How do we educate people? And how do we start building capacity that we can have more grazing? So it's this whole idea of reducing fire fuels with grazing. Now we all know that there's a whole bunch of other reasons to use grazing. We can, it's natural, it happens all the time. You know, it's probably one of the oldest vegetation management tools that we have, and it can change the communities. It can change it for good, it can change it for bad, but we know that grazing does work from a vegetation management. We just have to figure out what our goals are and what we want to do for grazing. So, and we have the science to apply that. We now know, we've known it all along, and Billy said it beautifully. It was like, yeah, we have all this science, but you know, we know what we're doing out there, and we've been doing it for like hundreds of years of grazing. So it's like, but now we want to apply the science that we know that grazing can influence things like fire spread, fire severity, fire intensity. So if we apply grazing from that standpoint, we want to interweave it with the landscape features and context. So how do we graze places that we couldn't mow? How do we move away from maybe chemical control? And how do we, pair it with prescribed fire? We have prescribed grazing. And then we look at the fuel characteristics. So we start to look at how do we then overlay grazing to get the best tools in management. So there's there's lots of types of grazing. We could go into whole bunches of grazing systems and we all have fancy names for them, but I kind of look at it like it's unmanaged or it's managed. So unmanaged, animals eat whatever they want. They leave, what they don't want to eat. It's kind of like when I go to when we all go to a smorgasbord, we might eat the good stuff and we leave all the vegetables. And so they'll eat whatever they want, and that could maybe result in overgrazing or undergrazing. Maybe they graze as long as they want in a certain area. Again, it could cause some problems. They go where they want, and it's kind of like that wildlife situation where they're not having to migrate, and so they're kind of just hanging around. So they're not managed. So from a managed standpoint, we're looking at the land is usually subdivided, or we at least use some kind of a grazing system to move the animals around. So you're all familiar with that, and so it's we can fence off sensitive areas. We can rest and rotate and use and apply different kind of grazing systems. So in general, we talk about grazing. So what I came up with this idea. You can't read that, but it's off a blog that I have. It talks about meet your perfect match. So it's this idea of how do we get more people to select grazing as a tool. So I started thinking about this and kind of started talking to RMAC about it and got this idea. And I thought, well, I'll just add a little humor to it too. And so it's kind of a dating service. So it's match.graze, and it's this idea that if you graze sheep or you graze goats or you graze cattle, you can go on this a survey, which I have right here if you want one, and you can fill it out. And you fill it out and you say, I'm a sheep grazer. I have my area that I cover. My county is maybe Fresno, Madera, Mariposa. That's as far as the 3 counties I want to go to, or maybe I'll cover the whole state of California. I might have 100 head of sheep. I might have 10,000 head of sheep. And it just to kind of get an idea to start to populate this list. And so in that, anybody can put it down. You can put it down if you have 1 sheep, or you can put it down if you have 1,000 sheep. So, and cattle and goats. And so it's this idea of first starting to build the capacity of this list. So I've pushed it out. We've had a few people filling it out. I've had people filling it out from other states. I'm not sure how that's going to work, but it's this idea, let's start here. Because I can't go out to the landowners, to the public and private landowners and say, hey, you guys want to graze? And they're like, sure, where are the people? How do I find these people? And I'm like, well, I got a list, but I don't have a lot of people on it yet. So I need to push that out. So then I stepped back again and I said, okay, I want to get into my mind, what do I mean when I have this list, and how can I help people to define what they are? So I put them into tiers. These are my tiers. You can decide if you like them or not. But we have in Sonoma County, and it's a very small, it's a very urban, rural interface county. And so my tier 1 is my neighborhood grazing, and it could be like the Marin grazing as well, in the sense of this is folks that have small rural properties, and this gal that does the grazing at the Pencrow Grazing Project, she's with Fibershed, and she has a dozen or so sheep, and she moves her sheep and she grazes her sheep on her property, and then down the road, somebody else has got a half an acre, and she moves them down there, and down the road they've got another acre. So she moves them all around this neighborhood, and it could be a neighborhood that and now it's built up to 50 acres, but it's all small parcels. We're very parcellated in Sonoma. And so she's using this as a way to feed her animals. She's using it as a goodwill. She does a barbecue at the end. It's a really community based. So I've had other people express an interest in that. We really want to do this community grazing. So we're building community. Just thinking about the Marin project where they're grazing the goats, there's other areas. We've already got the goats there. why can't we then move them to more areas to graze? So thinking about how we can expand once we've got the animals there. So that's tier 1 with the community grazing. So tier 2, I likened it what we think about contractor targeted grazing. So it's this idea that it's we're really focused on fire fuel reduction. We might have a larger scale, and we have frequent movement of the grazers. And so they're grazing for, they're under a contract to graze for certain specific goals, vegetation management, biodiversity, species column, different things like that. And either the grazer is paid through contract grazing, or there's an exchange and they're not paid, but they don't have to pay for the grass. So this is the contract grazing. Then the third one is the typical leased grazing. It's the typical ranchers, it's Tim, it's Billy, it's those folks that have a leasing agreement and they're grazing and they're usually paying for that grazing. So you can have sheep grazing private land, public land, Forest Service, BLM kind of a thing. And so that tier 3. But what I thought about it is like those tiers can go across back and forth. We could definitely have somebody like Tim Koopman could be grazing a very large allotment, and then he's got either somebody that he wants to help intern or mentor, or he's related to, and they can take a portion of his cows and they can target graze a certain area for a certain period of time, and then they come back to the herd. I've got a large sheep producer in Sonoma that kind of lends out his sheep and for folks to target grazing, and those folks that are now in the tier 2 are getting paid using the tier 3 sheep. And so what that means is that tier 2 doesn't have to necessarily own a whole bunch of, let's say, sheep or cattle or goats, but they flow back and forth. So obviously there would have to be an understanding of what that means from an animal welfare and taking care of the animals, and you have to have good agreements, that kind of a thing. But at least what we're finding when I've drilled down in some of these tiers, tier 1, those folks typically don't have like truck and trailers. They're not moving their sheep, via trailer. They're running them up and down roads, or they're moving them from neighbor to neighbor. And so more small scale, moving them around. They still have the same needs of fencing, infrastructure, labor, but sometimes with tier 1, the labor is going to be the neighbors are doing the labor for you. That tier 2, again, they're loading animals up. They're going to have mobile corrals. They're going to have truck trailer. They're going to move to a variety of different places because they graze and they go out. And tier 3, they're full-time cattle, sheep, goat ranchers, and they've got all of those, permanent and portable facilities, truck trailers, those kind of things. And so everyone always needs, there's liability issues, there's labor issues, and then there's the public education. So again, there's education across the board with, but I thought let's at least start to put these in tiers and have people to understand, because what I hear and is that when we talk about grazing, they're like, oh yes, I want goats. I would like to have goats graze. And I always smile when because that's always the thing, because they're so cute and they're really nice. And it's like, and I think those things are all true, but then what I ask the folks is, have you ever grazed goats before? And they'll say no. And I said, well, you might have to rethink that, because goats aren't as easy to control as some of the other species. Then you find folks aren't so interested in cattle because, they're really big and they produce a lot of methane. And I mean, those are the things I hear. So then they'd rather have sheep. So then it's like, okay, sheep are fine. What's your goals? Well, I really want to control the grass because I want these endangered forks. So then I have to kind of go, okay, let's have a conversation about what animals like to eat and what's going to happen if you put sheep out there. And do you have any predator issues? Yeah, we hear coyotes and mountain lions all the time. And I go, okay. So let's just sit down, stop and let's do some education. So what I'm finding that is there's a challenge, because because of the fires. Unfortunately, we now have this interest in let's graze, let's control vegetation. So, as I say, we rise from the fire, from the ashes, and we're reborn. The grazing is reborn. So there's an increased interest in grazing, especially to reduce fire fuel. So the cost can be prohibitive, because we really kind of struggle with what is that cost if I want to bring a contract grazer in. If you ask around my area, it's the going rate is $500 to $1,000 per acre. And people go, that's too much, I can't pay that. And you have to, so what we're gonna have to do is kind of start developing a checklist and kind of some cost studies to say, okay, well, what's the alternative for that? How much does it cost to do chemical? Can you actually mow? What's the cost of fire? What's the cost of preventing fire? So kind of building that into the mix. And then to kind of increase the number of grazers. So say everybody wants to graze and we don't have the supply of grazers. How can I increase the capacity? So we're looking at building more opportunities for grazing, educating through grazing schools. A lot of my colleagues are doing grazing schools. We need to increase the people that are interested in it. We need to make it more affordable for them. And for that, those kind of things, we need people to understand that these contract grazers need a base camp, because maybe they don't have land. They just have a truck and a trailer and they go around with their sheep and their goats and their cows, but eventually those guys, Lynn and I are gonna hang them up in a closet. Some people park them on a shelf, but at some point those animals have got to go somewhere and sit until they're called back to work. So we have to figure out home bases and how to help folks have a place to keep their animals, then to go out and to provide that service. So then it's this, how do we develop this match.graze and this match the supply to the demand? So lots of challenges, but there's lots of opportunities. As we've heard about, there's a variety of different things. We've all heard about Goats Are Us. There's a lot of government contracts, just a variety of different people that are willing to pay for grazing. So a lot of contract grazers, a lot of marketing opportunities. You can use this from a standpoint of folks grazing in vineyards. Now they're talking about, that's part of their story, their marketing story. So how can we help these, young entrepreneurs that maybe want to get into grazing? How do we develop that? Those opportunities, and like I said, more and more agencies are looking to do grazing and how to do that. So helping folks to build their capacity, to understand what to charge, how to expand these opportunities. So once they're done at this contract, they go to the next contract, and then they have a place to land when they're done. So that's the survey, make the match. And so you fill it out online, and we've put it out through the UC Cooperative Extension. That's only gotten me so far. And so what I'm thinking about doing, and it was kind of something I wanted to throw out today to see what you guys think, if you're familiar with Crop Mobster. It's started in Sonoma County. It's statewide, and it's a sharing and connecting for regional resiliency. So it's this idea of you kind of put it online saying, hey, I have, it started in the sense of I've got extra vegetables. So I've got extra vegetables. Anybody needs some tomatoes? Anybody needs some pears? Anybody needs some peppers? And so they make these exchanges, and it was free online, and people could go along and look and go, oh, hey, I've got a need for these peppers or these pears or whatever. So we thought we would put it out on Crop Mobster. Now it doesn't come free, and so it's just to push it out to say, calling all people interested in either being a grazer or people interested in having grazing. So I'm a little hesitant yet to put it out there for people. Do you want a grazer? Let me know. I want to first roll it out and say, I want it calling all contract grazers. I'm calling all people that are interested in contract grazing, or you have cows and you're looking for land to graze, which we all get calls for that as well. So it's this, so example would be, maybe somebody would put it out there and say free land for sheep grazing. Well, they might get inundated and they might get overwhelmed because people are like, oh yeah, free land, I'm all in. So before we do open that floodgate, we've got to have some kind of discussion and set some criteria and kind of this understanding of what the expectations are if you're a contract grazer, if you're a landowner, what are some of the needs for that, so that we make sure that we have success, absolute success. Now, when I presented this to RMAC, we had some discussion of, is this going to be, are they going to be certified? Are you going to certify these people? Do we just want letters of reference? I don't want to do that. That's not my role. I'm an educator, but I thought, what if we could make it something simple like just a Yelp review? So, you're the landowner and you hire, Lynn's out there with her 2 goats, and you put on there, she was great, the goats were great, or she never showed up, she's a flake, and so then people would go online and go, well, I'm not gonna hire Lynn to, graze again because it didn't work out. So maybe it's a self, a review. I'm open to suggestions. Just throwing it out there, I really just want to build capacity now, and so it's this whole idea of we've got this tool that we might use, looking at it. And so again, with that, as I mentioned earlier, folks are really always interested in goats and are concerned about cows for varying reasons. And so it's helping people to choose the right animal for the job. And sometimes it's all the above. And sometimes it's, depending really on helping people to understand, okay, I've got, like I said, we had an incident where we were trying to protect some very endangered forbs, and they wanted to bring sheep in. And I said, well, that's fine. I said, but that's to be the first thing they eat. And so then now we're grazing cows. And so it's just that understanding of it, it's just understanding to match the right animal to the job. And we've talked about what, and helping the landowner to understand what maybe some of the goals are. There might be first and foremost fire, and then once we get past the fire, we want to look at, so is it, you want to control invasive grasses, forbs, browse, or conifers. And, there's pros and cons to it, and being realistic about that. It is definitely more environmentally friendly. We can really market it that way. It can eliminate risk of odors or dust or, petrochemical energy by reducing the amount of mowing that we might do, or maybe you can't even mow because it's so steep. It's socially acceptable now. People are more embracing grazing. It's natural. It's got that green image. It costs more. It could potentially cost more. There might be regulations against grazing. There might be a predator risk. There might be theft or vandalism, or somebody might not like cows and come shoot them. And like I said, I've had those issues of people saying, well, it'd be okay if they grazed goats, but not cows because they produce methane. And I was like, okay, fine. And then the droppings. I mean, City of Santa Rosa, we opened up the book to say, okay, why can't we graze in the City of Santa Rosa? And they said you can. First, you need a permit, and then you have to clean up all the droppings before you leave where you're grazing. So you can see we've got a lot of education to do, but again, they opened up the books, they're interested. We just have to do a lot of education to that. So helping people to understand, I don't want people just to jump into grazing because we have to think about, healthy animals. We have to have good experiences. We can't have sick, unhealthy animals out there. We're concerned about animal welfare. Obviously, we've got to contain them, this whole idea of them getting out. So it's like, how do we work on, if you don't have permanent fencing, how can we help people get fencing? Or if we can partner with NRCS to get folks equip funding that can help bring in grazers, and then start to look at if that's a tool they want to continue, how do we help them find funding for more perimeter fencing? How do we look at supplementation to get the animals to eat in areas that they wouldn't normally do? Do we need shelter? Do we need handling predator risk? Is it okay that we bring in the barking guard dogs all night long into high-end homes, and then educating people what that means? Transportation, care, and supervision. Of course, those are all really critical. So then we have to look at, we just have to have this dialogue and this continuing education and really focused education. We've done a lot of education with folks talking about the importance of grazing and why we implement that. But we need folks to understand this is a business. They're making money. They need to be compensated. We need to, both parties have to have a shared vision, and we've talked about that, what the goals are, so that there's expectations, so that if you leave the grazing, that you do it in a way that both parties have a positive experience, and so that they're really promoting grazing. Again, going back to understanding, which we've all talked about, what the preferences are for different animals. So we want to really focus on that. Goats, sheep, cattle. We could also throw in horses in there too as well. And then this whole idea of how do we have a contract or have a really good communication. And one of the earlier speakers talked about communication. Very important, so that everybody understands what the expectations are. Something like a job description, where time frame that you're going to be there, payment schedule, so that people are getting paid, indemnity clause, or the insurance. because you're moving animals around. We've got issues where we've got animals moving around, sheep in particular, and the guard dog goes with them. So either the neighbors go and pet the guard dog, so then the guard dog jumps and goes back to the neighbors to get more pets, or, we've moved them around and then the dog jumps to chase the predator, and the animal control picks them up because there's not associated where that land is not associated with the dog owner. So again, lots of issues that we're having to deal with as far as trying to get the grazing up and running. Things like we've heard about herders, fencing, whether it's permanent or temporary, how it's, if it's electric, how do we make sure people know about that? Obviously predator control with, and then I love the fact that this is like the second time you're gonna see this, but the idea is this public outreach. This is the same, only you can prevent forest fires from Nevada, but it's like, it's catchy, it gets people to understand. I mean, fire is right in our faces, unfortunately, and it's just more opportunities. Is to really push that out, that grazing can be used as fire fuel reduction, and in a really important way. And it's one of those tools that maybe you do, shaded fuel breaks, and then maybe you do some prescribed fire, but then we're not gonna burn every year. So how can we keep that vegetation down? And we can do it through grazing. And like I said, public outreach. So this whole idea about marketing. So we heard about vernal pools, native species, the whole idea of invasive species control, and then this idea about marketing. Our only winery that burned in the fire was Paradise Ridge. Paradise Ridge has brought sheep into their vineyard. They didn't have them before. And tomorrow, one of the news channels from San Francisco is coming up for a story, because it's a neat story. They're rising from the fire, if you will, and they're using it as a marketing tool. And they want to really start expanding it and using this in their winery. But right now they're using it as a tool to get people to come back to Paradise Ridge, to market their brand. So it's a really great way to add that into it. So that, I can read that. So this is from the Targeted Grazing Handbook. So that the material is there. We just need to pull it out and figure out how we best can apply it in today's world. And so then the natural power for rivery and the knowledge of how grazing influences vegetation communities can be skillfully combined to convert livestock grazing into a powerful tool for vegetation management. And I think that says it all right there. It's like, we just need to figure out how do we build the capacity to have more people grazing and have more choices for folks, and then to really push it out to the public to really want to embrace and have grazing as one of their permanent tools in their toolbox. So thank you.
Thank you. Matthew.
Yes.
Almost to the end, folks. All right. So, and I'm going to bring these guys back up for a short panel right at the end. So Matthew Spiro is also with University of California Cooperative Extension. You are going to tell us a bit about CRM and targeted grazing programs, right?
I am.
Okay.
I'm going to focus on that. In fact, I have a pretty simple charge. I'm going to keep it that way. Hopefully it's going to be short. Mark introduced me again. My name is Matthew Shapiro. I'm coming here today with sort of two affiliations. The first listed here is as president-elect and chair of a CRM subcommittee within the California Pacific section, or CalPAC section of the Society for Range Management, which is the professional society that represents both scientists, practitioners, and natural resource managers internationally on rangelands. And then again, and I've mentioned it before, I'm the livestock and range advisor for Ventura and Santa Barbara counties. So I've been asked to talk about two programs that are both programs, yes, but they're actually quite different. And I think it's pretty important right off the bat to emphasize their difference. The first on the left is the Certified Rangeland Manager Program, CRM. It's been mentioned a couple of times already today. And it's a program that's existed for 25 years. It's administered both by the Board of Forestry and CalPAC in a sort of hybrid arrangement, which is unique in the state. And the second program we'll be discussing is a program that doesn't yet exist, and it's proposed currently at the national level. And I'm pretty interested in being here today, being with this group, although we have thinned out a little bit, I think, by the end of the day. But I'd like to hear feedback from what we think about this particular proposal. So it's the Targeted Grazer Certification. So this is the code in the California Code of Regulations, which creates and defines the Certified Rangeland Manager Program. It's towards the end, and it's actually a part of the Professional Foresters Licensing Act, which is from 1972, and I'll get into that history a little bit. But there at the very end, there is a section which allows for specialties. Specialties that are that might function similar to a license that a registered professional forester would have, but are in a different discipline. It allows for a specialty in it would allow for specialties in a variety of disciplines. It so turns out that the only specialty that has been, or discipline that is sought a specialty certificate is the rangeland community. And so you see the language there for what you probably can't see, it's in tiny print, but the language for this allowing for specialties, and then the specific language for the CRM program. I did want to emphasize, it's come up recently, I was pleased to see that, and you can see it there in bold, that the actual legislation in California Code allows for both the science of managing rangelands, but also the art. So as I mentioned, I don't want to digress too much because it's more interesting for history geeks, but the program, well, the PFLA, the Professional Foresters Licensing Act, dates back to the 70s. I have sort of benefited from an oral history of sorts from a phone call with Dr. James Bartolome from UC Berkeley, who was around more or less when the initial discussions regarding the RPF program first got off the ground. And it was, as an aside, it was interesting for me to hear and discover that the early conversations in the 70s actually involved 3 disciplines. It was wildlife, range, and forestry. This is prior to 1972 and the formation of the program, and that wildlife and range representatives who were on this panel that ultimately developed the PFLA, they dropped out of the licensing, moving down the pathway towards licensing because they felt like it was an undue government overreach into disciplines of wildland management. And so the only discipline that remained was forestry. And so they developed their own licensing, which was passed and made into law in 1972. An important detail is that foundational legislation really broadly defined what forestry was. And it later created issues, and it took about 10 or 15 years for them to surface. But essentially, because of that overly broad definition of forestry, it became clear, and it was after a Professional Foresters Examining Committee subcommittee did some research, that this overly broad definition of what wildland management was, as written into the PFLA, meant that people and advisors and experts on rangelands had to also have an RPF license because the languaging was so broad. So beginning in the late 80s and into the early 90s, there was a series of committees that worked this issue through. In 1990, the state attorney general confirmed that forest essentially was synonymous with wildland, meaning therefore that if you wanted to advise on range management issues, you had to have an RPF. So the solution was in the early 90s for the California, then just the California section of the SRM, the Society for Range Management, to develop an analogous program similar to the RPF program. And they did that beginning in 1991. It stood for a couple of years alone before being codified into law. AB 1903 was passed in 1992, and in 1994, the language around certified rangeland managers was added into the California Code of Regulations, such that by 1995, the first certified rangeland managers were licensed in the state of California. The simplest way to think of it is that a CRM is analogous to an RPF, but on rangeland vegetation types. A few further details about what the CRM program looks like. As I mentioned, it's mostly administered by the CalPAC section of SRM. It is similar to achieve the certification. It's similar to what an RPF might go through. There's requirements for, you need basic education, most simply a range degree or at least related coursework. You have to have experience, at least 5 years working on the range type, preferably in California. You bring references, and then you also have to pass an exam, which is actually administered by PFEC. PFEC does have direct supervision over the CRM panel, which is a CalPAC body, but all individuals on the panel are appointed by PFEC. And as of March of this year, we have 72 active CRMs throughout the state, although 119 have been certified since that first one was in 1995, and 49 are providing consulting services across the state. I want to emphasize that the CRM license, like the RPF license, is a legally binding license, and it is required by law, the license that is, in order to conduct professional range management activities on non-federal lands, state lands, and private hardwood range types, hardwood range type forested landscapes. And it's been the source of some misunderstanding and hair splitting about what exactly that means. As far as I understand it, 10% is an important threshold in terms of forested landscapes. That if a landscape has 10% trees or more, then that triggers the CRM license. However, if a rangeland does not have the potential for permanent trees, technically you do not need a CRM license in order to advise on that landscape. So that's the CRM, and I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the proposed targeted grazer certification. And one of the important differences is that the CRM license is for managers and advisors on rangelands. So typically it's professionals who provide professional advice, whereas this targeted grazer certification would be for individuals who are actual practitioners. The Society for Range Management, which is an international organization, has been thinking about targeted grazing, prescribed grazing, for a number of years. The Targeted Grazing Handbook, which has been referenced a number of times, and there's a chapter in the literature that was passed out with today's workshop. That was published in 2006. The authors of that have worked very frequently and in close collaboration with the Society for Range Management. And so SRM has, over the past decade or so, tried to take a leadership role thinking about targeted grazing. And in fact, the SRM Board of Directors appointed the Targeted Grazing Subcommittee, which has been active over the last couple of years. And in that time, there was a suggestion that there might be a certification program, and I know Stephanie alluded to that coming up in her work as well. And at first there was some resistance, perhaps similar to the resistance that those early panel members back in the 70s had about some sort of government overreach or intrusion. More recently though, and specifically in Minneapolis in 2019 at the SRM International Conference, there was an agreement that SRM should move forward with this idea of having an international or national certification for targeted grazers. Claudia Ingham, who's the chairperson for that subcommittee, has written a memo to the SRM Board of Directors and has explained the purpose of the targeted grazing certification process. And she emphasizes, and it's my bold and underline, that the purpose is to endorse those grazers who possess a diverse set of skills and provide sound professional services in keeping with good science, livestock management, and business practices. And so again, the CRM and RPF licenses are required by law in order to advise on lands in California. This would not be a licensing process like that at all, but simply an endorsement of the competency and professionalism of grazers themselves. SRM, in moving forward, feels like it's an organization that is uniquely positioned to sort of host this certification. And I'm open and interested in getting feedback from this group about whether you agree with that position. But the justification is that SRM has long connected science and landscape management, and that it is an organization that already includes practitioners, natural resource managers, and scientists. So it's a good place where there's a nexus already with the people who need to think about how we might develop a certification process. the certification would look similar to the RPF and CRM licensing. It would include a written exam. Sort of uniquely, we were thinking, or the subcommittee is thinking, that it would include a portfolio, which can take a number of sort of multimedia dimensions. Ideally, it would include photos or videos of projects with specific annotations describing things like, site selection, interface between the grazer and the hirer, presence of certain plant species, the likely response to grazing browsing, the need for repeated treatment, etc. And then finally, in addition to the written exam and the portfolio, there would be written testimonials from people who have hired the grazer previously. This is even harder to see. These are items that have been gone over a couple of times in the course of today's workshop. I think are interestingly organized here. This is from a document that has been developed by Karen Launchbaugh at the University of Idaho and Beth Reynolds, who runs the sheep unit at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. And they've organized how to think about how to approach what grazers and the people who hire them need to know. And that's the name of the document, Need to Know. They've organized it into 3 sections: management of livestock, management of natural resources with livestock, and management of the targeted grazing business. I thought Andre did a really excellent job and sort of more or less touching on all of these things. There's a lot more to say, but I think as we develop a potential certification, I see a real advantage, even in just the process of developing a certification, is that us as a discipline and those of us who are involved in wanting to see this service be put out on the land more frequently, that we really spend time thinking about what are the standards and best management practices related to each of these categories. And so there's value, even if the certification process doesn't get up off the ground, there's real value in beginning to have these conversations both nationally and at the state level. So I have a series of questions and thoughts. I know that my talk sort of segues into a panel. I'm hoping some of these things stimulate conversation amongst the group. Fundamentally, is a certification or endorsement program even necessary? Is it useful to codify standards and best management practices, and people on the ground? Andre, Beth Reynolds, in addition to working in Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, also ran targeted grazing business for many years. And my sense is that individuals who are working on the ground would like to see something like this happen, in part because for as many good operators as there are a lot of new operators or operators who don't necessarily know what they're doing. Would it be useful to codify best management practices? If so, who else needs to be involved? SRM is trying to take a leadership role in this, but recognizes that other agencies need to have a voice. The Targeted Grazing Committee has already been in touch with the American Sheep at ASI. There's conversations with California wool growers in a vague sense, but we need to think about who else needs to be at the table as we develop these best management practices. And then, does California need its own certification program? SRM is working from a national level. There will be an effort, and at least in the way that it's laid out, to have in the certification process at least someone on the panel who has intimate place and site-specific knowledge from where the grazer who's applying is coming from. Yet, California's unique place with unique challenges and a unique regulatory environment. Do we need our own certification? The CRM certification, which was developed in 94 for California, was actually emulated on a national level, and the SRM runs the CPRM, the Certified Professional Range Manager certification. So there is precedence for California sort of having its own certification effort. And then, of course, other things that I haven't thought of. So with that, I have my email address on this slide. If you're interested in that need to know document that was developed by Karen Launchbaugh and Beth Reynolds, I'd be happy to send it to you. It's more or less ready to be shared. But again, with that, I think I'll conclude and hopefully segue into the panel. Great.
now we're ready for our last new speaker, and then we can proceed to wrap it up. I would like, however, I'd like to invite up Bob Gillespie. Bob is with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Natural Resources Conservation Service. I'd asked Bob to come up and say a few words, however he wants to do it, maybe about, so for those of you who may not be familiar with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, they do have a few programs that may be able to assist with some dimensions of doing some grazing practices, although, as Bob will probably tell you, it can be a little complicated in some circumstances. But NRCS is one of the numerous agencies that could be involved, that could provide at least a supporting role in participating in these kinds of field treatments and grazing practices. So you say however much time you want to use, and then we'll adjourn to the.
Not take very much time.
That's fine.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you for hanging in there, folks. My name is Bob Gillespie. I'm the State Rangelands Management Specialist here in California for the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is an agency within USDA. We typically, and I'm a technical expert, at least that's what they tell me. I'm not a programming person. I'm not a money person. I know how to deal with plants, I know how to deal with animals, I know how to make it so that they can work together, but the dollars, as long as I've got a wallet that's got some thickness to it, I'm good. That being said, we do have some programs. The best place to get the most honest local answer to any of your program questions is frankly not me. It is your local NRCS office. We have an office in every county in California, I believe. I don't think we have any multi-county offices, and I think we do have a few. But we do have presence across the state of California. And you can look us up on the internet and find out where your local office is. Programs are meant to be incentive-based, not meant to pay 100% or even a certain percentage, although we try to target a percentage. And they're there to help. The sticky issues can come in from a couple of points. One is we can't pay for the same thing on the same piece of ground that we already paid for once before, unless something's different. The other sticky thing is if you've got a small landowner who wants to bring in some animals to graze for fire, fuel, management purposes, we're gonna have to think about how to make that fit through our convoluted system, and we don't pay for boundary fences, which may be all that 5-acre piece can handle. So there may be some limitations of any infrastructure, but prescribed grazing is a practice that we can help you with, help the landowner with, help the grazer with, try to understand what are the objectives and how can we meet those objectives, or at least start to meet those objectives. I'm going to stop because
no, I'm not going to let you get off that easy. All right, so one thing to understand. So the primary purpose, and correct me if I'm wrong, Bob. Wow, that's blowing in my ear. The primary purpose of NRCS is to assist landowners with conservation practices. And those conservation practices may be in the purposes of conserving things like soil and soil health, plants, vegetation, wildlife habitat, that sort of things will all kind of fall into these conservation type practices. So in the case that it happens to be that a landowner that is seeking to be able to, let's say, be able to use grazing as a practice on their property going forward, Bob's right. I used to work for NRCS myself, so we both kind of share this. I also used to work for Cooperative Extension, which is why I brought all that into. So I work for lots of agencies that they all eventually show me the door. Yeah. Anyway, but the goal here is if you are working with if there's a landowner or you are a landowner and you would like to be able to use these practices, It is sometimes possible if you go and talk to the staff, your local NRCS office, and say, look, my property lacks some things that are necessary to be able to support an ongoing, the use of grazing for managing fuel. Let's say the property is in a place that is in a strategically important area for protecting a community or protecting resources. So wildlife habitat that's deemed to be critical, riparian areas or other things, and the property is in an important place. And you and the fire crews have decided that it would be really valuable to be able to maintain that property going forward. NRCS cannot and will not pay for the ongoing work. However, if it was maybe under some circumstances, if you needed to have water source developed, or maybe some cross fencing on a space that was set up, or some other things that could be done to allow the property to say grazing was an appropriate tool to be grazed going forward, it is sometimes possible that with working together with NRCS, if a true and legitimate conservation objective can be defined, NRCS may be able to provide some assistance with it, not through the project or anything else. Is that more or less?
Pretty much more or
I
less.
mean, we'll say it, maybe less than more sometimes. Yeah. So NRCS can be one. Another thing that NRCS staff can be also useful for is part of the planning process. So sometimes NRCS staff, they do have access to useful information, soils information sometimes about vegetation communities and things that a property owner, especially someone who's new to a property, may not know very much about it. NRCS staff can be of some assistance if they're getting some additional information that may not have already known about their property. And so that can be helpful as well. And so if you're going into a planning process where, okay, we want to do these things on the property, NRCS can be one useful resource like cooperative extension. So for private property owners or community groups that are trying to form and organize them up with a plan, I think that NRCS staff and cooperative extension staff and, to forget them, resource conservation district staff also can be very helpful in the planning process for this information.
Yeah. And we try to use scientists who have knowledge.
That's good.
Great. Okay. So then with lab. So Matthew and Stephanie, so we'll do this quickly. So if you have any questions about the things that we've all described about Stephanie's program, yes. So there you are. I was looking for you earlier. So, okay, yes. I've got the mic. Hey, Lance. Yes, you do. Oh, shoot. Oh, my God. He's on the phone. Okay, yeah, right. Okay, Dick, where? So where'd he go? Scott Wood. Thank you. I thought that I read
Can I
that.
ask my question?
Yes, you sure can. Please ask the question.
I actually have two questions. The first one is for Bob. So what I heard from you is basically that through NRCS, can you hear me okay? Okay, I can't really hear myself in this for no reason. Through NRCS, it's possible, it's not necessarily like a straightforward go-to, but it's possible to utilize prescribed grazing for a one-time fire fuels management. My question, is that right?
Yes, and I would say for more than a one time, because prescribed grazing is an ongoing practice.
Okay.
Okay, the cost share part of it, the dollars may only be once. Actually,
So-
we could probably do it up to 3 times, but it's getting into the details and the weeds I don't really want to get into,
Okay.
if I don't have.
Well, so my question is, how do we make that a go-to for the local branches? Like if I have somebody come out from my local NRCS office to say, look at creating a fuels management plan, how do we make it so that prescribed grazing is like a line item for them? Because as far as I understand it now, it's not. Like they're going to recommend some sort of like mechanical thing to happen. How do we get this idea that we have that it is possible to use prescribed grazing in a fuels management plan through NRCS on the docket, as it were, for the local agencies?
So the local office and the local agencies, we're always fighting the battle of who's got the money and who's got the work, and we don't have enough people, and everybody's in that situation. To bring it from the back burner a little bit further forward into a hotter burner would be to work with the district conservationist and the RCD manager in that office and say, hey, we've got this need. How can we build this need into your daily work? And they may have some ideas to be able to make it happen. You've got to start with the local.
So I have to contact each individual NRCS office?
So if you have something that is larger than, just one county, that's more of a regional, we do have some regional offices. You can contact me and tell me what your project and your idea is. If it's statewide, it's statewide. If it's more than statewide, then I've got to go talk to some other people.
Bob, can I just ask, just to help this question, don't currently, if somebody's gonna do brush management as one of your practices, and so instead of, if they decided not to use herbicides or mechanical means or what have you, and wanted to use animal means, if that's not a current allowable or fundable practice as the program goes, is that something at the state level that can be discussed? Is that answering your question?
Maybe.
Well, because they have to have practices that are approved and then, the criteria to fund them, because I worked a lot with this program as well, but I'm just saying, I think, so they have another opportunity if someone prefers one type of management over another on that particular acre or acres.
Yes. Targeted grazing for weed control or brush control. In other words, not for fuel reduction. That's a little different story. Okay, but for a particular species or group of species control that are noxious, then we do have chemical and mechanical ways of doing that and helping people out. If you want to go with grazing to do that, then we would do that under prescribed grazing. And that's a little different ball and practice. And then as far as whether it's emphasized at any particular level as far as cost share goes, or as far as time commitment from us without cost share, then that the time commitment from us without cost share really comes down to that local office. Time commitment from us for dollars comes from our state and counties and areas. Blake.
So I have a question about I thought the fuel reduction is if fire risk is an issue, that is part of our resource concern that can be addressed under our conservation practice. I thought that was one of our resource concerns.
Yes, I was speaking to the brush management side of things, which is not the fuel reduction. Prescribed grazing can be used to manage fine fuels.
Okay, and I guess I just want to add it, I think Mark earlier mentioned, we have a suite of practices can help facilitating the management that may be needed for to doing target grazing, like water, fence, and all the other things, including providing shelter, I believe. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but so those can work together to achieve the goals and objectives of the prescribed grazing, I think.
And we would be working with the private landowner or the contract grazer, or whoever it is that we need to be working with, to look at that whole picture and figure out what's needed, not only on this piece of ground, but if it's for the contract grazer, what do you need 12 months out of the year? And how are you going to be doing that? And whether it's portable equipment or permanently installed.
Right, the details need to be sorted out working with the producer.
Kosenko with California Wool Growers. Just, Matthew was asking about the certified targeted grazer program. Just a few comments. At this point in time, industry hasn't asked for a certified program, and many of our members have not indicated such one is needed. Also, some of our members, their customers, which are various public agencies, have indicated they're not asking for a certified program either. So I would caution SRM when they're looking at this program. Industry's not asking for it. When California Wool Growers was approached earlier this year, we said we would be willing to discuss why we are not looking to go down that path. And there was no follow-up on it. But just to make that note, you're asking for input today. At this point in time, nobody's been asking for such a program. So we do wonder what the motive is behind a certified program at this point, but our door is always open. And we have quite a few targeted grazers who have not indicated such. So that is our input today on that. And more than happy, like I said, you could recontact us and we'll sit down and we'll discuss why.
Great, and thank you. Thank you for that feedback. And I have to admit, I am not intimately involved with how this has developed over the last couple of years. I think, it sounds like maybe the producers and targeted grazers who work with California Wool Growers are not interested. I suspect or imagine that others have approached SRM. And so again, I think it's just a place where we need to have further conversation. And I want to emphasize that, the work is, well, first of all, it would be voluntary. The purpose, it's not, there are no requirements, there's no licensing. You can be a targeted grazer without needing to have this particular certification. So if it sort of dies of its own accord, that's one thing. But, the work is preliminary. And so there is lots of room for conversation and maybe even conversation to go a totally different direction.
Question.
One more question. Okay, and I want to let Scott also give us.
Yeah, so I was actually going to direct my question to Scott.
Good.
And tie it back to Len Nielsen's talk earlier, where he touched a little bit on the CAL FIRE grants, but I'm curious what kinds of components of getting grazing on the ground would be covered under these CAL FIRE grants and what that looks like now, how many projects are, if you're aware of any that are funded that target that use grazing, and what that might look like in the future in your perspective.
So the CAL FIRE has a couple different grant programs. The two primary ones are funded through Senate Bill 901, which authorizes up to $200 million per year for the next 5 years, totaling $1 billion. Those funds for the fire prevention grants program, which is the one that I'm speaking about, is allowable activities include grazing. Specifically, it's designed to do 3 things. It's designed to reduce the number of starts, wildfire starts. It's designed to reduce the number of acres burned, and it's designed to reduce the number of structures damaged or destroyed by wildfire. So if you've got an eligible community group, which could be a city or county government, it can be state agencies, it can be nonprofits, 501c3s, they're eligible to apply for grant funding for those type of activities. And the 3 primary ways that we accomplish that reduction in acres or starts or houses is we want to see hazardous fuels reduction. We want to see public education, or we want to see planning efforts. So grazing activities would definitely fit under hazard fuels reduction. We're anticipating within the next couple of weeks that we will be releasing, opening the application period. The application period is typically for a couple months, probably in sometime in December. The application period closes. Those applications are reviewed first by your local CAL FIRE unit, and then through a state review committee where awards are made. We're anticipating that out of that $200 million per year, that we will be awarding approximately $50 million per year for the next 5 years. Those grants are good for a 3 or possibly a 4-year funding cycle. So what that means is when this round of grant funding opens up, it will probably span a full 9 years worth of grant activities.
Does that funding include infrastructure?
Nope. Does not include things like roads or suppression resources, water tanks. We're strictly looking at fire prevention activities. The easiest way to find those is if you go to fire.ca.gov, which is CAL FIRE's website. Scroll down, you'll see a grants link. By clicking on that grants link, it'll open the 5 primary grant programs. Fire prevention grants is one of those grant programs, and you will see a link to the local contact, which is a CAL FIRE unit. When Len was speaking about that this morning, and the contacts, those are those same contacts for any grant information.
But that also would not include fencing then?
If there was grazing, it might, and that was part of the contract, that might be an allowable expense, but it has to clearly be tied to that.
Thank you. My name is Lee Hazeltine. Bill, you specifically did not mention institutional and industrial ownership. So are they excluded from participating in this program, or did you just not mention that?
For-profit companies are not eligible. So if it was an activity that was run through 501c3, like a fire safe council, or through a city or county government, it would be an allowable activity.
So even though the grazing might occur on for-profit properties, if it's administered through, say, a fire safe in an urban interface, that is allowable?
It should be.
Yes. And just a follow-on question, do you have a subcommittee or group that's obviously talking about where it seems to be going in terms of where you think that to apply for something that's new and different is kind of like a crapshoot? So I'm wondering if you have had some discussions about, gee, we've got this money to set aside to do something. Have they identified some areas that they have a high interest in terms of, and are you willing to put that forward? Hey, we'd really like to see these funds go into such and such type or style of projects. Is that?
So even though the funding legislation is new with Senate Bill 901, the grant program is not new. This is the 3rd year that the grant program has funded activities. 2 fiscal years ago, we funded $80 million. This past fiscal year, we funded $44 million. So this approximately $50 million is going to fit in that same program footprint. As far as how those dollars are allocated, the preference is that we see those activities identified in the CAL FIRE unit fire plans that are also part of the California Strategic Fire Plan. And that's why the units take the first crack at grading those to ensure that they meet the elements and the goals of those unit fire plans.
Can you share with us the 80 million and the 44 million, just in broad strokes, where most of that money is going? Is it going for manual clearing activities? Is it going for controlled burn activities? This, we're talking about targeted grazing, and there is 44 million or 80 million. There's not even really $1 million yet spent on targeted grazing strategies over multiple years. Can you help us sense where those dollars have been going historically, and so we understand the context?
They have gone statewide. They primarily target state responsibility areas. So those are the areas that CAL FIRE has primary authority, financial authority for wildland fire suppression. If you divide the state into thirds, about a third is federal ownership, about a third is locally protected, and about a third of the state, or 33 million acres, are protected by CAL FIRE. So it's predominantly targeting those lands.
What activities?
Okay.
It's a broad mix of fuels reduction, public education, and planning activities. And it doesn't quite break down into a third, but it's fairly close to that.
So are the CFIP projects in that pool?
No, CFIP is a separate program. So the two primary programs that are driving those dollars are forest health. That's one of the CAL FIRE grant programs. Its funding source is roughly similar to the funding sources that I've mentioned, but it's a different goals and different activities. Fire prevention grants is specifically the funding source that I'm referring to.
So is that predominantly then chemical or mechanical or hand crew type labor work projects?
Probably the activity that we see the most is mechanical fuels reductions, whether it's mastication or hand crews, pile burning. It can include controlled burns and can include range type activities.
I was just gonna say, thank you. My name is Sue. Sorry, I'm from the Board of Forestry. Anyway, Scott, you've given us some really good detailed reports on the board that we could, you could take a look at, see the breakdown of what's been funded in the past. And I think that would be really helpful in understanding how the money's been allocated. In the last 2 years, there's been priority given to counties that are that were in the drought mortality areas. And I think, is that going to happen again this year?
It'll be one of the factors that we look at for the grading criteria, yes.
So I didn't say my name earlier. I'm Marie Hoff, and I worked with Fireshed, RMAC, Health and Wilderness, etc. I run a small collection. My question is for Stephanie and for Matthew for both the Match Dog Raise program and the possible proposed certified grazers program. Which, by the way, I think Erica left, but I'm a CWGA member and a targeted grazer, and I have no idea of this, so I think you should keep pushing for it. I don't know if many of us have been formally asked if we're interested or not. I have no idea. But I think it sounds like a really interesting program. So my question for both of you is, have either of you guys either put any consideration or thought into things like market stabilization or things to do with like competition amongst grazers, keeping either grazers, some grazers from say like sort of cutting in and being like, hey, I can offer this at like $20 an acre less or something like that, or just there right now there's such a variation in cost. There's some people who are some people would graze that vineyard for free, which I would argue is totally ridiculous. And then there are some people who, like the upper end, I've heard of like $3,000 an acre for grazing a vineyard. Is there anything that either of you guys have considered in terms of that, in terms of, keeping competition in like a healthy zone and not sort of a pariah kind of zone?
Thank you for that. I haven't really seen that capacity get so big, but as far as leasing lands, I do always have the conversation with folks when they call me, landowners call me and they say, how much should I charge for grazing? And so we go through the whole idea of what their goals are, what species to use, and then just to kind of help them understand that just getting the most for that grazing lease is not always the best thing, and helping them understand being part of the community, expanding capacity, picking a local source. So I think there's an opportunity to have that discussion and to make sure that when we do that outreach for the public to increase opportunities for targeted grazers is to have that be part of the conversation, and then helping them to understand that if we can, it's not about, and really not about money, it's about reaching the resource goals and how best to do that, and so that they can understand some of the issues as far as grazing. So it's a really good point and one that we'll definitely look into.
I would emphasize, I think it's a really good, interesting question. I can share just a little bit of personal experience down in Ventura County. I was having a conversation with the VMP coordinator down for Ventura County Fire, which is CAL FIRE down there. And he was explaining that Ventura County Fire has a couple of dozen acres that they maintain throughout the county with goats, and they have for many years. That they were working with an operator out of the Southern Central Valley who would come over, was happy with the operator, did a really good job year in and year out. By law, had to put out the proposal every year and receive new proposals. And this particular year, a new grazing outfit came in and did a less good job, was on the same amount of acreage, was not as reliable, was just new, and and didn't do as good of a job as the previous operator had. The VMP coordinator, of course, had to select the contract of the newer operator because that newer operator came in at a lower bidding price per acre, and as was explained to me, you had to take the contract at the lower price. Something like a targeted grazing certification might fit well in a situation like that, where it could be something that this particular VMP coordinator with the county fire could point to and say, yes, perhaps this bidder is coming at a higher price, but also has this certification that comes from an accredited institution and could help justify why a public agency would choose a bid at a slightly higher price, but could guarantee professionalism and competence kind of thing.
I was just going to add one other thing. We've got our regional parks and Ag and Open Space, when they do contracts for grazing, they have a check. One of the point systems is if they're local. So they're giving more points to folks that are local. So we could include that in as well.
Two really quick questions. I'm Jeannie Mesha from the State Water Board. And Scott, the fire prevention grants, I'm on your website, and it has a community fire prevention and a CCI fire prevention grant. They seem like two separate grants.
CCI is the funding source for Senate Bill 901. That's California Climate Investments. And that's Assembly Bill 32, cap and trade legislation. So it funds from the CCI.
And then what's the community fire prevention grant? What's that funded from?
That may be referencing $10 million that was awarded last year. And due to the short time frame of those grants, we primarily concentrated on planning and public education activities. We did fund a few fuels reduction if they had essentially all their ducks in a row, if they had CEQA done or almost done. The funding cycle was really tight, and we felt that if those activities weren't already being addressed, they wouldn't be able to finish the work in that time frame.
Have you obligated all the money from the CCI to projects? Or are you still going to do some solicitation for proposals?
We anticipate the next couple weeks releasing, opening up the grant application process. So that will be for just under $50 million worth of potential awards.
Okay. I manage a grant program at the Water Board. It's for reducing non-point source pollution to waters of the state, and we get some proposals for fuels reduction projects. And we funded a couple, and I'm wondering, it's a little hard for us to tie fuels reduction to non-point source non-point source load reduction to waters of the state, and I'm wondering if I should push those applicants to your grant program.
We'd be happy to receive those.
Might be a more appropriate funding source. Okay. My second comment is for Matt. I'm also currently working on a statewide grazing guidance in response to a board direction a few years ago, and it's still in development. And, we're looking at proactive ways for ranchers to be proactive in how they manage their ranching operations. And we're intending it to be a non-regulatory guidance document, and so I would be very interested in the targeted grazer certification.
Hey Matthew, Stephanie, so what's the status on the update to the ranch water quality program? Have you guys heard anything on that at all in the last year? No, the University of California Cooperative Extension, you are? Okay, interesting, okay, great.
So how many more questions you want to take at a certain time?
Yep, we are out of time. I think we're there. Great, okay. Thank all of you on the panel. All right, so then I'll wrap this up and cut us all loose. Sorry about that.
So, in conclusion, this was meant by RMAC as a starting conversation to kind of get things rolling. I think that the committee members and I all would like to see the connections, hopefully, that we've made here. We'd like those of you with an interest in this topic to stay in communication with us. Ask us questions. If you begin to try to work on a local project and you're needing resources, need some connections, please talk to us. And if there's anything more that you think that RMAC could do to help to open some doors and get things moving that could assist you in whatever part of the state that you're in, please talk to us. Because we like to see this continue to move forward. We're going to continue working on it, and you probably couldn't expect to hear more from us. But please give us feedback about this, what's good, what's bad, if we missed some major topics, and we'll take that under advisement. But with that, I want to let you guys get plowing through traffic. So thanks all of you for coming today. It's been time.